The crystalline waters of Nexus Station's training complex shimmered under artificial sunlight, their azure depths stretching down nearly 200 meters. Commander Elena Vasquez stood at the pool's edge, her regulation swimsuit drawing curious stares from the assembled crowd of alien cadets. The polycarbon decking felt cool beneath her bare feet as she gazed across the impossibly vast natatorium, its walls lined with viewing galleries packed with representatives from dozens of species. "This is unprecedented," rumbled Korthak, the station's head aquatic trainer. The massive Zargoth's 6 arms rippled with muscle as he gestured toward the pool, his chitinous carapace gleaming like polished obsidian. His compound eyes fixed on Elena with what she'd learned to recognize as amusement mixed with condescension. In 3 centuries of interspecies training, no mammalian biped has ever completed the deep current trial. Elena rolled her shoulders, feeling the familiar burn of chlorine in her nostrils. It smelled like every pool she'd trained in back on Earth, from the cramped community center in her childhood neighborhood to the Olympic training facility in Colorado Springs. The scent triggered muscle memory that went deeper than conscious thought, the rhythm of stroke and breath, the feel of water flowing past her skin, the precise timing that separated champions from also-rans. Around the pool's perimeter, dozens of alien cadets watched with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. A cluster of Vorthan scouts, their silvery skin catching the light like mercury, whispered among themselves in their musical language. Near them, a group of insectoid thrix clicked their mandibles in what Elena had learned was their equivalent of nervous laughter. Even the usually stoic Remnari observers, tall and wraith-like in their environmental suits, had gathered to witness what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure. "The human physiology is simply inadequate for aquatic excellence," continued Korthak, his voice carrying across the vast chamber through the translation implants each cadet wore. "Your species evolved for terrestrial locomotion. Your limbs are inefficient, your oxygen capacity limited, your hydrodynamic profile." He gestured dismissively with 2 of his 6 arms. "Adequate for survival, perhaps, but hardly competitive." Elena had heard variations of this speech for the past 3 weeks, ever since she'd arrived at Nexus Station as part of the first human exchange program with the Galactic Training Consortium. Every instructor seemed eager to explain why humanity's recent addition to the galactic community would never measure up to species with millions of years of evolutionary advantage. The physics instructors pointed out that human brains couldn't process the complex gravitational mathematics that came naturally to the crystalline Nexari. The combat trainers noted that human reflexes, while respectable, paled compared to the lightning-fast responses of the predatory Kethvar. And now Korthak was explaining why she'd never match the aquatic supremacy of his people. The Zargoth had dominated underwater environments across 17 star systems for millennia. Their bodies were living torpedoes, streamlined carapaces, powerful swimming appendages, and the ability to extract oxygen directly from water through specialized gill slits. They could dive to crushing depths that would liquefy human bones and swim at speeds that made Earth's fastest marine predators look sluggish. In every recorded deep current trial, Zargoth cadets finished in the top positions, usually separated by mere seconds, in times that would have shattered any human endurance record. "The trial distance is 12 kilometers, Korthak explained, his translator rendering his subsonic rumbles into crisp standard. 6 kilometers down to the thermal vents at the pool's base, 6 kilometers back to the surface. The current changes direction every kilometer, requiring constant adaptation of technique and strategy. The water temperature drops 40 degrees Celsius at depth, and pressure increases accordingly. The fastest recorded time belongs to Cadet Zakth of my own species, 37 minutes, 42 seconds. Elena nodded, her face impassive. She'd studied the records obsessively since accepting this challenge 3 days ago. The trial had been attempted by cadets from 43 different species over the past century. Only 16 species had ever produced a cadet capable of completing the distance. None had been air-breathing mammals, and certainly none had been human. The challenge had started innocuously enough. Elena had been working through her assigned cardiovascular training, a modest 2-kilometer swim that most Zargoth younglings could complete before their first molting, when she'd mentioned that the distance felt short compared to her usual workouts. Korthak had laughed, a sound like grinding stone, and explained that humans weren't built for serious aquatic athletics. When Elena had politely disagreed, citing her species' surprising versatility, the trainer had made his fateful declaration: "No mammal can outswim a Zargoth in deep water. Your physiology makes it impossible." The words had hit Elena like a slap, not because they were cruel. She'd heard worse during her years climbing the ranks of Earth's military, but because they were delivered with such casual certainty, the same tone she'd heard from male officers who insisted women couldn't handle combat roles, from rivals who claimed her working-class background made her unfit for elite units, from coaches who'd written her off as too small, too slow, too stubborn to make it at the highest levels. She'd simply nodded and said, "I'd like to try the deep current trial." The request had caused a minor sensation. Word spread through the station's corridors with the speed of gossip among bored military personnel everywhere. The human cadet, the first of her kind to attend the prestigious academy, wanted to attempt a trial that challenged even the most accomplished alien swimmers. Betting pools sprang up in the rec areas. Most wagers focused not on whether she'd succeed, but on how quickly she'd be forced to abort the attempt. Now, standing at the pool's edge with hundreds of eyes upon her, Elena felt the familiar pre-competition calm settling over her. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing deepened, and the nervous energy that had been building for days crystallized into focused purpose. This was the moment she'd been training for her entire life, though she'd never imagined it would take place 2,000 light-years from Earth in front of an audience of aliens who considered her species a curiosity at best. Korthak raised one massive arm, his timing device gleaming in his grip. "The trial begins on my signal. Cadet Vasquez, you may withdraw without penalty if—" "I'm ready," Elena interrupted, stepping to the pool's edge. The water looked impossibly deep from this angle, its bottom lost in blue-black shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. She'd made deeper dives during her Navy SEAL training, but never for this distance, and never under these conditions. The silence stretched across the natatorium like a held breath. Elena could feel the weight of skeptical stares, hear the subtle sounds of aliens adjusting position for a better view of what they expected to be either a brief spectacle or a rescue operation. She blocked it all out, focusing instead on the water before her. Its surface was mirror-smooth, disturbed only by the gentle circulation currents that would become her allies and enemies over the next hour. "Your stroke technique is inefficient," observed Zargoth, the current record holder. The young Zargoth floated nearby in the shallow end, his movements effortless, as his swimming appendages carved lazy patterns through the water. "Mammals waste energy with vertical displacement. Your species fights the water instead of joining with it." Elena had watched recordings of Zargoth's record-breaking swim dozens of times, studying the fluid grace with which he moved through the water. His technique was indeed perfect for his physiology, 6 swimming arms working in synchronized waves, his streamlined body cutting through the water with minimal resistance, his breathing apparatus allowing him to extract oxygen without ever breaking the surface. It was beautiful, efficient, and utterly impossible for human anatomy to replicate, but Elena had noticed something else in those recordings, something that none of the alien observers had commented on. Zargoth's technique never varied. He maintained the same stroke rate, the same depth patterns, the same mechanical precision from start to finish. It was the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, and it was predictable. Humans, Elena had learned during her years of competitive swimming, had a different relationship with water. They weren't born to it like the Zargoth, didn't possess the natural buoyancy of the Aquari or the pressure resistance of the deep-dwelling benthic species. But they had something that millions of years of evolutionary perfection sometimes bred out of a species: the ability to adapt, improvise, and endure beyond the limits of logic or biology. "Beginning descent protocol," Korthak announced, his voice echoing across the chamber. The pool's sophisticated current system engaged with a low hum, and Elena felt the water's movement shift as artificial flows began their complex pattern. The deep current trial wasn't just about distance, it was about adapting to constantly changing conditions that mimicked the chaotic underwater environments where Zargoth warriors had learned to fight and hunt. Elena had spent the past 3 days studying those currents, timing their shifts, memorizing the patterns, but she'd also spent time learning something else, something that no alien cadet had ever needed to master. 5 seconds, called Korthak. Elena's muscles coiled. Around the pool, conversation died as hundreds of beings focused their attention on the lone human figure poised at the water's edge. She could feel their expectations: polite interest from the instructors who'd written her off, genuine curiosity from a few progressive cadets, and barely concealed anticipation from those who expected to witness confirmation of human limitations. 3 seconds. The water called to her, its familiar embrace promising both challenge and sanctuary. Elena had learned to swim in the chlorinated pools of her childhood, but she'd mastered the art in the unforgiving waters of Earth's oceans. She'd trained in conditions that would have killed most of the aliens watching her: icy Arctic waters that numbed flesh within minutes, rolling seas that tossed even experienced swimmers like leaves, murky rivers where visibility dropped to zero and only instinct guided navigation. Begin. Elena's dive was a thing of practiced beauty, her body cutting through the water's surface with barely a splash. The familiar shock of submersion hit her, cooler than expected, with a slight salinity that reminded her of Earth's seas. She arrowed downward, her powerful kick driving her toward the distant bottom where thermal vents waited like beacons in the darkness. The first kilometer passed in a blur of rhythmic strokes and controlled breathing. Elena had settled into her race pace, not the sprint that alien observers might expect, but the measured cadence of an ultra-distant swimmer who understood that endurance mattered more than speed. Around her, the water grew gradually cooler as she descended, and the pressure began its steady increase against her eardrums. Above her, she knew, the viewing galleries were probably filled with commentary about her technique. Too much surface action, the experts would say. Wasteful vertical movement. She was fighting the water instead of flowing with it, burning energy that would be desperately needed in the deeper sections where pressure and cold would sap strength from even the most prepared athlete. They weren't wrong, from a theoretical perspective. Elena's stroke was indeed less efficient than the undulating perfection of Zargoth swimmers or the jet propulsion technique of the aquatic Tarathi. But efficiency wasn't everything. Sometimes raw determination and the willingness to suffer through suboptimal conditions mattered more than perfect form. The 2-kilometer mark brought the first current change, and Elena felt the water's flow shift from a gentle downward pull to a lateral drift that tried to push her off course. This was where most non-aquatic species struggled, fighting the current instead of using it. Elena had studied the patterns carefully, though, and she was ready. Instead of fighting the lateral flow, she rolled into it, using the current's energy to accelerate her forward momentum while angling her descent to compensate for the sideways drift. It was a technique she'd learned during long-distance ocean swims on Earth, where currents and tides were constant adversaries that could either destroy a swimmer's plans or become powerful allies for those who understood their patterns. The move saved her precious energy while maintaining her target pace, but more importantly, it demonstrated something that the watching aliens hadn't expected to see: adaptation in real time. Most species swam the deep current trial the same way every time, relying on evolutionary advantages to overcome the changing conditions. Elena was doing something different. She was thinking her way through the challenge. 3 kilometers down, the water temperature dropped noticeably, and Elena felt the first real bite of cold against her exposed skin. Her regulation swimsuit provided minimal thermal protection, another disadvantage that the experts had been eager to point out. Zargoth cadets didn't need insulation. Their chitinous shells provided natural temperature regulation. The furry Yalani species had evolved coats that trapped warming air bubbles. Even the reptilian Sarok could slow their metabolism to conserve heat in cold water. Humans had no such evolutionary advantages. What they had instead was something that Elena had spent years perfecting during winter training sessions in Earth's Arctic waters: the ability to generate heat through pure muscular effort and maintain core temperature through controlled hyperthermia. It wasn't efficient, and it wouldn't work indefinitely, but it could carry her through the worst of the temperature gradient if she managed her energy correctly. The 4th kilometer brought Elena into truly alien territory. Here, the water pressure was beginning to affect even her enhanced physiology, and the cold had moved from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Her stroke rate had necessarily slowed, but she'd compensated by refining her technique, finding tiny improvements in her hand placement and body rotation that squeezed extra distance from each movement. More importantly, she was beginning to implement the strategy she'd spent 3 days perfecting, a technique so fundamentally human that none of the alien observers would see it coming until it was too late to counter. The deep current trial had been designed by and for species that possessed natural aquatic advantages. Every challenge in its course played to the strengths of evolutionary swimmers while punishing the weaknesses of land-adapted species. The changing currents favored flexible, serpentine body plans. The pressure changes rewarded species with natural depth adaptation. The cold water eliminated warm-blooded mammals whose metabolisms couldn't efficiently maintain core temperature. But the trial had one weakness that its designers had never considered, because none of their species had ever needed to exploit it. The thermal vents at the bottom weren't just navigation markers, they were heat sources. Elena had studied the deep water specifications obsessively, noting every detail about the volcanic vents that marked the trial's halfway point. The Galactic Training Consortium had installed them as realistic environmental challenges, mimicking the conditions that military swimmers might encounter on frontier worlds. They provided both navigation reference and a final test of temperature adaptation, forcing swimmers to navigate through superheated water columns before beginning their ascent. For species with natural temperature regulation, the vents were just another obstacle to endure. For a human swimmer who understood thermal dynamics and had the desperate creativity that came from being perpetually underestimated, they represented opportunity. The 5th kilometer tested Elena's resolve like nothing she'd experienced on Earth. The pressure was crushing now, forcing her to equalize constantly as her descent continued. Her ears popped with each meter, and she could feel the weight of water above her like a physical presence pressing down on her shoulders. The cold had moved beyond discomfort into genuine hypothermia territory, and she had to fight to keep her stroke technique from deteriorating as her muscles stiffened and her coordination suffered. But she could see the glow now, the distinctive red-orange luminescence of the thermal vents rising from the pool's artificial seafloor. They pulsed like deep-sea beacons, superheated water columns that would have been lethal hazards for most swimmers, but represented salvation for someone desperate enough to use them correctly. The viewing galleries above were probably buzzing with speculation about her declining pace. Elena's times for the past 2 kilometers had been respectable, but not exceptional, well behind the splits that elite Zargoth swimmers typically posted at this point in the trial. The experts would be noting her technique deterioration, the visible effects of cold and pressure on her mammalian physiology, the way her stroke rate had dropped as she fought to maintain forward progress through increasingly hostile conditions. What they wouldn't be noting because they had no frame of reference for it, was the calculated precision with which Elena was managing her approach to the thermal vents. Every choice she'd made for the past 2 kilometers had been building toward this moment, positioning her for an approach angle that would let her implement a strategy that no alien swimmer had ever needed to consider. The 6th kilometer brought her to the vent field, and Elena felt her heart rate spike as she saw the full scope of the challenge that lay before her. The thermal columns rose from the artificial sea floor like pillars of superheated water, each one hot enough to cause severe burns to unprotected skin. Most swimmers navigated around them carefully, treating them as hazards to be avoided while searching for the marker buoys that indicated the official halfway point. Elena swam directly into the largest thermal column. The shock of superheated water against her hypothermic skin was indescribable, like being struck by liquid fire after hours in an ice bath. Every nerve ending screamed in protest, and for a moment she almost lost her stroke rhythm as her body reacted to the violent temperature change, but she held her position in the column's heart, letting the rising water carry her upward while her core temperature spiked back toward normal range. It was dangerous beyond description. Too long in the superheated water would cook her alive, while too little time wouldn't provide enough warming to offset the hypothermia that had been steadily sapping her strength. Elena had calculated the exposure time during her preparation, but calculations were theoretical. Reality was holding position in a column of near-boiling water, while every instinct screamed at her to flee, trusting in timing she'd practiced in simulation but never tested under these conditions. 30 seconds in the thermal column, long enough to bring her core temperature back to functional range, to restore circulation to extremities that had been going numb, to recharge her metabolism for the 6-kilometer ascent that would determine whether her gamble had been brilliant or suicidal. Elena burst from the thermal column with her skin flushed red, but her strength renewed, her stroke suddenly crisp and powerful after kilometers of gradual deterioration. The marker buoy floated 10 meters away, and she tagged it with a hand that no longer trembled with cold before beginning her ascent toward the distant surface. Behind her, the thermal vents continued their eternal dance, pillars of superheated water that represented hazards to be avoided for every species except one that had learned to find opportunity in the most desperate circumstances. The 7th kilometer of Elena's swim, her 1st kilometer of ascent, passed in a blur of renewed power and precision. The thermal recharge had worked exactly as she'd hoped, restoring not just her core temperature, but her muscular coordination and cardiovascular efficiency. Her stroke rate increased dramatically, and she began gaining time on the benchmarks she'd memorized during her preparation. More importantly, she was ascending through water that was gradually warming and decreasing in pressure, environmental changes that favored her physiology over that of deep adapted species. Where Zargoth swimmers needed to carefully regulate their ascent to avoid pressure-related injuries, Elena's mammalian respiratory system was designed for rapid pressure changes. Where other species struggled with the warming water that interfered with their temperature regulation, Elena thrived as conditions moved closer to her optimal performance range. 8 kilometers into the trial, Elena realized she was no longer swimming alone. Word of her unconventional thermal vent strategy had apparently spread through the station's communication systems, because the viewing galleries that had been politely occupied during her descent were now packed with spectators. Aliens who had been conducting other business had abandoned their duties to witness what was becoming clear was not the expected display of human limitation, but something unprecedented in the history of interspecies competition. The water around her carried the subtle vibrations of excited conversation, translated fragments of dozens of languages blending into a low hum of speculation and surprise. Elena could feel the change in atmosphere even from 60 meters below the surface, the shift from patient observation of an inevitable failure to genuine uncertainty about the outcome. Her stroke had found its rhythm now, powered by renewed warmth and the satisfaction of watching carefully laid plans come to fruition. The thermal vent strategy had been risky beyond measure, but it had worked exactly as intended. More than that, it had demonstrated something that none of the watching aliens had expected to see: a human swimmer adapting to aquatic challenges not through superior evolution, but through superior tactics. The 9th kilometer brought another current change, this one flowing laterally across her path with enough force to challenge even experienced swimmers. Elena had studied this section carefully during her preparation, noting how most cadets fought the cross-current directly, using brute strength to maintain their intended course. It was the obvious approach, and it was energy-intensive to the point of exhaustion. Instead, Elena rolled into a modified side stroke, using the current's energy to accelerate her forward motion while angling her path to compensate for lateral drift. The technique looked unorthodox compared to the mechanical precision of evolutionary swimmers, but it was devastatingly effective. She carved through the cross-current with minimal energy expenditure, actually increasing her pace as she used the water's own force to drive her ascent. Above her, she could see the first hints of surface light, pale artificial illumination that marked the end of the trial's crushing depths. The sight triggered a psychological boost that she'd learned to harness during her years of competitive swimming. Distance events weren't just tests of physical capability, they were exercises in mental endurance, battles against the voice that whispered about exhaustion and encouraged surrender when victory seemed impossible. Elena had trained that voice into submission years ago, during pre-dawn practice sessions in Olympic training pools and exhausted finishing kicks that decided championships by hundredths of seconds. The aliens watching her had evolutionary advantages that she could never match, but they'd never needed to develop the peculiarly human capacity for suffering through seemingly impossible challenges simply because surrendering wasn't acceptable. The 10th kilometer brought her into the depth range where most alien swimmers found their optimal pace, the sweet spot where their evolutionary advantages balanced perfectly with environmental conditions. Elena was swimming in their element now, but she was no longer the struggling mammal who'd begun this trial 6 kilometers below. The thermal vent strategy had transformed her from a hypothermic survivor into a competitor operating at peak efficiency, and her lap times reflected the change dramatically. Spectators in the viewing galleries were checking their chronometers with increasing frequency, comparing Elena's splits to the historical records that had seemed safely beyond human capability. The numbers told a story that challenged everything the Galactic Training Consortium thought they knew about mammalian aquatic performance. Zargoth, the current record holder, had descended through these depths at a measured pace designed to conserve energy for the brutal final kilometers. His splits showed the mechanical consistency that made Zargoth swimmers so formidable, identical times for each kilometer segment, never varying more than a few seconds, despite changing conditions. Elena's splits told a different story entirely. Her descent times had been respectable, but unexceptional, exactly what the experts had predicted for a mammalian swimmer pushing beyond her natural capabilities. But her ascent times were something else entirely, consistently faster than Zargoth's pace and accelerating with each kilometer as she moved into her optimal performance range. The 11th kilometer brought Elena into what distance swimmers called the death zone, the final stretch where accumulated fatigue fought against the psychological boost of approaching victory. This was where races were won and lost, where the difference between champions and competitors revealed itself in the ability to maintain pace despite screaming muscles and oxygen debt that made every breath a conscious effort. Elena had lived in this zone during her competitive career, had learned to thrive when lesser swimmers cracked under the pressure of ultimate effort. The sensation was familiar: burning lungs, muscles that felt simultaneously leaden and electric with fatigue, a cardiovascular system pushed to its absolute limits. But familiarity bred confidence, and confidence translated into maintained technique even as her body begged for relief. Around her, The water carried new vibrations, not just the excited chatter of spectators, but the focused attention of beings who were witnessing something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about interspecies capability. The casual dismissal that had characterized early observation had given way to genuine respect for what Elena was achieving, regardless of the final outcome. Commander Korthak floated near the pool's edge, his compound eyes tracking Elena's progress with an expression that would have been unreadable to most humans. But Elena had spent enough time around alien physiognomy to recognize surprise when she saw it, even filtered through chitinous features that had evolved for underwater combat rather than emotional expression. The 12th and final kilometer stretched above Elena like a tunnel of blue-white light, surface illumination that had seemed impossibly distant when she'd begun this descent 6 kilometers and 43 minutes ago. Every stroke brought her closer to air she could breathe without mechanical assistance, to the moment when she would either touch the timing pad as a victor or surface as a valiant failure who'd pushed human limitations farther than anyone had thought possible. Her body was operating beyond rational limits now, fueled by a combination of thermal recharge, tactical swimming, and the peculiarly human refusal to accept defeat when victory remained mathematically possible. The viewing galleries were packed with spectators who'd abandoned their duties to witness what the station's communication systems were already calling the most significant interspecies athletic event in galactic training consortium history. Elena's stroke technique had evolved throughout the trial, adapting to changing conditions in ways that rigid evolutionary programming never could have anticipated. Her early kilometers had been marked by the inefficient surface action that alien experts had predicted, but she'd refined her form continuously, finding improvements that squeezed extra speed from each movement. Now, in the final kilometer, she was swimming with a precision that matched the best evolutionary swimmers while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had carried her through the thermal vent challenge. The mathematics of her pace were becoming clear to observers who understood interspecies athletic performance. Elena's cumulative time was approaching territory that had been considered exclusively Zargoth domain, and her final kilometer split was shaping up to be the fastest single segment ever recorded by a non-aquatic species. But mathematics were theoretical, and Elena was operating in the realm of pure will. Distance swimming had taught her that the body's perceived limitations were often psychological constructs that could be overcome through properly applied mental discipline. Pain was temporary, defeat was permanent. The voice that whispered about exhaustion and encouraged surrender had no power over someone who'd learned to find strength in suffering. 800 meters from the surface, Elena passed through the final current change, a swirling updraft that most swimmers rode passively while focusing on stroke technique and breathing rhythm. Elena used it as an opportunity to implement one last tactical adjustment, a burst of speed that caught the artificial current at its peak velocity and amplified her natural stroke power into something approaching jet propulsion. The move was risky to the point of recklessness, demanding precise timing and energy reserves that she might not possess after 11 kilometers of maximum effort. But risk was a human concept that other species approached with evolutionary caution, while Elena had learned to embrace calculated danger as a competitive advantage. 600 meters from the surface, spectators in the viewing galleries were openly discussing the possibility that they were witnessing history in the making. Elena's splits had been consistently faster than Zakth's record pace for the past 4 kilometers, and her final push was building into something that challenged every assumption about mammalian aquatic capability. 400 meters from the surface, Elena could see the timing pad that marked the trial's official finish, a glowing beacon that had seemed impossibly distant when she'd begun this ascent in the crushing depths where thermal vents provided the heat she'd needed to transform hypothermic survival into competitive excellence. Her stroke rate increased again, drawing on reserves that shouldn't have existed after nearly an hour of maximum effort in conditions that were hostile to her basic physiology. But Elena had learned years ago that impossible was often just another word for hasn't been done yet, and she'd built her career on proving that human determination could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. 200 meters from the surface, the viewing galleries had gone silent with the focused attention that accompanied truly historic athletic performances. Elena's approach angle was perfect, her technique flawless, her pace building toward a finish that would either shatter records or provide the most spectacular near miss in interspecies competition history. 100 meters from the surface, Elena allowed herself to acknowledge what the observers had been calculating for the past several kilometers. She was going to win. Not just complete the trial, not just prove that humans could compete with evolutionary specialists, but actually defeat the best time ever recorded by any species in the most challenging aquatic trial in galactic athletics. The realization triggered a final surge of speed that transcended anything she'd achieved during her competitive career on Earth. This wasn't just about personal victory or species pride. It was about demonstrating that intelligence, tactics, and determination could overcome any evolutionary advantage when properly applied. 50 meters from the surface, Elena's stroke found a rhythm that seemed to pull power directly from her will to succeed. Every movement was economical perfection, every breath precisely timed, every muscle fiber contributing to forward motion with mechanical efficiency that matched her alien competitors while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had carried her through 12 kilometers of constantly changing challenges. 25 meters from the surface, Elena could see individual faces in the viewing galleries, alien features marked by expressions of surprise, respect, and something approaching awe. She'd begun this trial as a curiosity, a representative of a primitive species testing herself against galactic standards. She was finishing it as something unprecedented, a human athlete operating at the absolute pinnacle of interspecies performance. 10 meters from the surface, Elena's hand stretched toward the timing pad that would record either triumph or the most impressive failure in athletic history. The mathematics were beyond debate now. Her time was going to shatter Zargoth's record by a margin that would force complete reevaluation of human athletic potential. 5 meters from the surface, Elena touched the timing pad with a stroke that combined perfect technique with the raw determination that had carried her through 46 minutes and 12 seconds of swimming that redefined interspecies athletic achievement. The moment Elena's fingers contacted the timing pad, silence fell across the natatorium like a physical presence. For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the gentle lapping of displaced water as her momentum carried her against the pool's edge. Then the displays activated, holographic numbers materializing in the air above the pool with mathematical precision that left no room for doubt or dispute. 46.127. Zargoth's record had stood at 37.421. Elena hadn't just broken it, she'd obliterated it by nearly 9 minutes, a margin of victory that challenged everything the Galactic Training Consortium understood about interspecies athletic capability. Elena floated at the pool's edge, her chest heaving as she processed oxygen debt that represented 46 minutes of maximum effort in conditions that had been designed to defeat her species. Her skin was flushed from the thermal vent exposure, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes held the satisfied gleam of someone who'd just accomplished something that observers would discuss for decades to come. Commander Korthak approached the pool's edge, his massive form moving with uncharacteristic hesitancy. The Zargoth trainer who'd confidently proclaimed that no mammal could outswim his species now faced mathematical proof that his assumptions had been fundamentally flawed. His compound eyes studied Elena with an expression that combined respect, confusion, and something approaching reverence. "The timing systems have been verified," he announced. his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed chamber. Cadet Vasquez has completed the deep current trial in 46 minutes and 12.7 seconds, establishing a new record by— He paused, consulting his instruments. 8 minutes and 30.6 seconds. The silence stretched for another heartbeat, then shattered as hundreds of alien voices erupted in simultaneous conversation. Every species represented in the viewing galleries seemed to be discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed, their various languages creating a cacophony of speculation that the translation systems struggled to process. Elena hauled herself from the water with movements that betrayed her exhaustion, but she managed to stand straight as she faced the assembly of beings who'd gathered to witness her expected failure. Water streamed from her regulation swimsuit as she stood on the pool deck, a solitary human figure surrounded by aliens whose evolutionary advantages had just been overcome through tactics, determination, and the peculiarly human refusal to accept limitations as permanent conditions. Zargoth approached with the fluid grace that marked his species' movement through both water and air. The former record holder's chitinous features were unreadable to most observers, but Elena caught the subtle signs of an athlete recognizing superior performance when confronted with it. His 6 swimming arms rippled with controlled motion as he extended one in what she recognized as a gesture of respect. "Your technique," he said, his subsonic voice rendered into standard by his translation implant, "utilizes thermal dynamics in ways that violate established swimming theory. The energy expenditure should have been catastrophic. The temperature shock should have disrupted your stroke rhythm beyond recovery." Elena accepted the gesture of respect with a nod that acknowledged both his athletic excellence and his willingness to recognize achievement that challenged his worldview. "Human physiology has some disadvantages in aquatic environments," she agreed, her voice still slightly breathless from her recent exertion. "But it also has some advantages that aren't immediately obvious. We're very good at adapting to suboptimal conditions." Around them, the conversation was shifting from shocked speculation to detailed analysis of Elena's performance. Alien sports scientists were requesting access to the trial recordings, eager to understand how a mammalian swimmer had achieved times that redefined interspecies athletic potential. Military observers were discussing the tactical implications of Elena's adaptive swimming techniques. Cultural attachés were already composing reports for their home governments about this demonstration of human capability, but Elena's attention was focused on the small group of human exchange cadets who'd been scattered throughout the viewing galleries, watching their species mate attempt something that everyone had expected to end in spectacular failure. Their faces showed a mixture of pride, relief, and something approaching vindication. For weeks, they'd endured polite condescension about human limitations, well-meaning explanations about why their species would never match the specialized capabilities that millions of years of evolution had granted their alien classmates. "The thermal vent utilization," observed Dr. Yathara, the station's chief physiologist, "represents innovation that no previously tested species has demonstrated. Most swimmers treat environmental hazards as obstacles to be avoided rather than resources to be exploited." Elena wrapped herself in the thermal blanket that an attentive technician had provided, grateful for its warmth as her body began the recovery process from nearly an hour of maximum effort. "That's probably because most species are already optimized for aquatic performance," she replied. "When you're operating at a disadvantage, you learn to find advantages in unexpected places." The comment triggered another wave of discussion among the assembled observers. Elena's victory wasn't just an athletic achievement, it was a demonstration of tactical thinking that challenged fundamental assumptions about how evolved species approached competitive challenges. Where specialized swimmers relied on evolutionary advantages to overcome environmental obstacles, Elena had turned those same obstacles into competitive resources through applied intelligence and desperate creativity. Commander Korthak raised his arms for attention, his authority sufficient to quiet even the excited chatter of beings who just witnessed something unprecedented. "Cadet Vasquez," he announced, his formal tone carrying clearly across the natatorium, "your performance today has exceeded all projected parameters for mammalian aquatic achievement. The deep current trial record now belongs to your species, and this result will be transmitted to all member worlds of the Galactic Training Consortium." Elena straightened despite her exhaustion, recognizing the formal significance of the moment. This wasn't just about her personal achievement or even human athletic capability. It was about perception and respect in a galactic community where humanity was still proving its worthiness of membership. Her victory in the thermal vent depths had implications that extended far beyond swimming records. "However," Korthak continued, his compound eyes focusing on Elena with an intensity that commanded absolute attention, "your tactical innovations raise questions about established training protocols. The thermal vent utilization technique you demonstrated violates every safety guideline we have established for the deep current trial. By all theoretical calculations, your approach should have resulted in severe thermal injury or cardiovascular collapse." Elena nodded, understanding the trainer's dilemma. Her thermal vent strategy had been based on human physiological capabilities that didn't exist in other species, the ability to tolerate rapid temperature changes that would have been lethal to most aliens. "I calculated the exposure time based on human cold water survival training," she explained. "We've developed techniques for using environmental heat sources during hypothermic emergencies. It's dangerous, but manageable if you understand the timing." The admission triggered another surge of conversation among the observers. Elena's victory hadn't been achieved through superior conditioning or natural ability. It had been won through the application of survival techniques developed by a species that had learned to thrive in environments hostile to their basic physiology. The implications were staggering for military observers, who understood that battlefield adaptability often mattered more than theoretical advantages. Dr. Yathara approached with instruments designed to monitor post-exercise physiology, her curiosity clearly overwhelming her professional reserve. "Your core temperature readings during the thermal exposure phase exceeded safe parameters for any known mammalian species," she observed, studying her data with fascination. "The cardiovascular stress indicators suggest that you were operating beyond sustainable limits for the entire final phase of your ascent." Elena submitted to the medical examination with the patience of an athlete accustomed to post-competition protocols. Her body was indeed showing signs of extreme exertion: elevated temperature, stressed cardiovascular markers, muscular fatigue that bordered on exhaustion. But these were familiar sensations, the expected aftermath of pushing human physiology to its absolute limits in pursuit of victory. "Human athletes train specifically for operating beyond sustainable limits," she explained, as Dr. Yathara recorded her vital signs. "Our competitive philosophy assumes that optimal performance requires exceeding theoretical safety parameters. We call it leaving everything in the pool." The phrase required explanation through the translation systems, but its meaning resonated with alien observers who recognized the concept of total effort expenditure in pursuit of victory. What impressed them was Elena's casual acceptance of physiological stress that would have been considered dangerous for most species, her matter-of-fact discussion of techniques that deliberately courted hypothermia and thermal shock as tactical resources. Zargoth had remained near the pool's edge throughout the post-trial discussions, his attention focused on Elena with the intensity of a professional athlete studying a superior competitor. When the medical examinations concluded, he approached again with the deliberate movements that marked formal communication among his species. "Your victory represents innovation rather than evolution," he stated, his subsonic voice carrying clearly through his translation implant. "You achieved superior performance not through genetic advantage, but through tactical application of species-specific capabilities that we had not previously encountered. This is unprecedented in interspecies competition. Elena recognized the significance of the acknowledgement. Zargoth wasn't just congratulating her on a fast swim, he was formally recognizing that she'd redefined the parameters of aquatic competition through human tactical innovation. For a species that had dominated underwater environments for millennia, such recognition represented a fundamental shift in perspective. Different species evolve different solutions to environmental challenges, Elena replied, her diplomatic training evident in the careful phrasing. Humans developed adaptability because we didn't have the luxury of specialization. Sometimes that turns out to be an advantage. The gathering was beginning to disperse as word of Elena's achievement spread throughout Nexus Station, but the core group of observers remained, clearly reluctant to end their exposure to something that would be discussed in military and athletic circles for years to come. Elena found herself at the center of conversations that ranged from technical analysis of her swimming technique to broader discussions of human potential in interspecies competition. Commander Korthak approached for final comments, his massive presence somehow less intimidating now that Elena had proven her species capable of achievements that challenged his fundamental assumptions. "Your performance today will require revision of our training protocols," he admitted, his tone carrying respect that had been absent during their pre-trial interactions. The possibility of tactical thermal utilization had never been considered because no previously tested species possessed the physiological tolerance for such techniques. Elena wrapped the thermal blanket more tightly around her shoulders, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from proving doubters wrong through superior preparation and execution. "I studied the trial parameters for 3 days," she said simply. The thermal vents were listed as environmental hazards, but the specifications included temperature and flow data that suggested they might be useful for someone desperate enough to use them correctly. The admission drew appreciative rumbles from several alien observers who recognized tactical innovation when they encountered it. Elena's victory hadn't been achieved through luck or natural superiority. It had been the product of careful analysis, creative problem-solving, and the willingness to risk everything on a strategy that existed outside established parameters for aquatic competition. As the group began its final dispersal, Elena reflected on the broader implications of what had just occurred. She'd come to the Deep Current trial as a representative of humanity's newest members in the galactic community, carrying the weight of species-wide expectations and the knowledge that failure would reinforce every negative assumption about human limitations. Instead, she was leaving as the record holder in the most challenging aquatic trial in interspecies athletics, having demonstrated that human tactical innovation could overcome any evolutionary advantage when properly applied. The thermal vent strategy that had seemed desperately risky during her preparation had proven to be devastatingly effective, transforming hypothermic survival into competitive excellence through pure tactical thinking. But more than records or recognition, Elena had achieved something that would resonate throughout human space, proof that her species belonged in galactic competition not despite their limitations, but because those limitations had forced them to develop capabilities that more specialized species had never needed to acquire. Standing on the pool deck with water still streaming from her hair and the satisfied exhaustion of complete effort settling into her muscles, Elena smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who'd just changed the way an entire galaxy thought about human potential. The Deep Current trial would never be the same, and neither would the assumptions that had limited human participation in interspecies competition. Tomorrow, there would be other challenges, other opportunities to prove that humanity's place in the galactic community was secured not through evolutionary gifts, but through the determination to succeed regardless of theoretical limitations. But tonight, Elena Vasquez owned the fastest time in galactic aquatic history, and every human in the galaxy could point to her achievement as proof that their species had earned its place among the stars. The thermal vents continued their eternal dance in the depths below, pillars of superheated water that would forever represent the moment when human tactical innovation redefined the limits of interspecies athletic achievement.